Last time on Curmudgeon Media.
Alright, the gameplay! Yeah, it took me a fair while to get to the gameplay, but when you think about it, it's actually rather fitting for talking about a Persona game. As I said earlier, the game is a Dynasty Warriors tie-in, which means turning every character into a one-person army capable of obliterating everyone. It's certainly an odd franchise, and it isn't the most polished, and while certainly popular, hasn't been acclaimed for a while. In fact, looking at the reviews on Wikipedia, there hasn't been an above-average review score for a main game installment since Dynasty Warriors 4, which came out on the PS2 and Xbox in 2003. Having played it, I can understand why that is, as it's rather simplistic, repetitive, and
"This is a miracle bestowed upon me by the heavens!" Ah!
other reasons. But on the whole, it's a mindless but cathartic power fantasy fun. Then there's Dynasty Warriors 9, which, if it was a person, I'd take it to the hospital for a brain hemorrhage.
Ah!
Fusing it with Persona of all things is interesting, for a few reasons. On one hand, it's the exact opposite of Persona. Persona 5 is many things, but ultimately it's a tactics game. It's about your decisions and how you allocate your time to get the best results possible, not to mention its mountain of mechanics to keep track of. Dynasty Warriors probably has a lot of mechanics to keep track of, but ultimately it's a button masher where you keep hitting triangle until everything is dead, which is exactly what I'm doing in this footage. I am not exaggerating. But on the other hand, Dynasty Warriors is anime with a capital A. It's incredibly campy and over the top to such an endearingly ridiculous standard. Yep, that guy just mounted a horse in midair. And do you know what else is super anime, over the top, and campy? I'll give you a clue. It involves masquerade masks, talking cats, and fighting demons on toilets. So tone-wise, it seems like a match made in heaven. And hey, the Dynasty Warriors gameplay style, being the reverse of Persona 5, allows the game to completely reinvent itself, right? So, is it fun? Yes. Does Dynasty Warriors ultimately add anything? Sort of? Is it better than Persona 5?
No!
The combat is now a compromise between the two franchises. You can button mash until your heart's content, and you can pause the fight to use your personas. These can be used to deal extra damage, buff, take advantage of type weaknesses, etc. The iconic aspects like the all-out attack and even Royal's showtime has been worked in too. One thing I love is that you have the ability to swap between 4 of your party members at any point, meaning you're no longer limited to exploring the map as Joker. I mean, technically back then you controlled the others in combat, but they felt more like assistants to you rather than playable characters. Joker here still has the wildcard power, allowing him to hold multiple personas.
Fly! Leland! Satan High Pixie! Satan High Pixie! Lemire!
Arsene is once again reduced to the thankless job of starter Pokemon, and with this you can make personas of every type to take on any foe. For a while. You can use your persona to highlight enemies and their weaknesses would appear. In this state, you can choose which attack to use, or if you're Joker, shuffle through your persona collection to pick the best move for the situation. Trouble is, there's no way prior to a fight to know what enemies will come up, so in terms of how the other 3 come into play, it's basically guesswork. So if your companions don't have any decent type matchups, you're basically left entirely reliant on Joker. This in turn means he will deplete his SP incredibly quickly while everyone else barely uses any. You can run away from fights, but not bosses or mid-bosses, some of which have no hints as to what they're weak to before the fight, and you can't swap out party members once a fight has started, so if you're not properly equipped to exploit their weaknesses, you're going to exhaust all of your healing items at best, and die anyway at worst. Even if all your team deals neutral damage, it's still an uphill battle, especially early on. See, you have 2 types of enemies, the generic Shadow Police Force and the various enemy personas. The police can be dealt with by button mashing, but the personas are the ones with strengths and weaknesses. Bigger personas have a guard, which you can break by using attacks they're weak to. Break their guard completely and you can do greater damage with an all-out attack. Hitting their weaknesses is the best way to deal significant damage to their guard. There are critical and technical attacks, but you can't really make consistent use of those until the late game. Basic attacks, or the Dynasty Warriors triangle mashing, does basically nothing. So if you don't have the party member with the correct type, you're at a massive disadvantage. This can cause a big enemy to obliterate you because, ultimately, you guessed wrong. There is a lot of guesswork in the main game too, but that was the point. Figuring out an enemy's weaknesses is part of the process, as they aren't given to you straight away, so you have to do lots of trial and error to see what works and what doesn't. Also, in the early game, hitting their weaknesses once is all you really need, because then you can just all-out attack and move on. With strikers, hitting their weaknesses once isn't enough. Exploiting elemental weaknesses doesn't work as well in real time. Dynasty Warriors has weaknesses too, but they don't matter one iota, because every enemy is weak to triangle. And even having the correct party member on your team won't matter if their SP is limited. SP runs out much quicker here than it did in Persona 5, likely because the game wants you to use all the other combat mechanics. So let's discuss those, shall we? What Dynasty Warriors adds to Persona are button combos that can do lots of area effect damage, as well as activating specific traits for each character. For example, Ryuji's special makes him less likely to flinch, or there's Zenkichi's Fury mode I mentioned in the last video. Certain combos can also call forth their persona and deal elemental damage. Square, 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 triangle for a 3-hit combo and end with a persona attack. And these don't cost any SP. Now, you may think, why don't you just do those combos to exploit weaknesses instead of just spamming magic? Wouldn't that be the more pragmatic option? And that is a very good question. No! For 2 reasons. Firstly, the persona attacks from the combo do surprisingly little towards an enemy's guard, making it far less powerful than a straight-up persona attack. Secondly, simply hitting persona enemies won't make them flinch unless you hit them with their weaknesses, so while you're executing your button combo, the enemy will still charge up and attack, which can stop you altogether. Then you'll have to try it again. So ultimately, it's more time consuming, it's harder to pull off, and it doesn't do as much damage. Which is genuinely a shame, because if it did as much damage, it could have been a great reward for players wanting to master each character's combos. There is, however, a third option, which does lots of elemental damage and costs no SP, using your environment. There are objects throughout most of the battle arenas that can deal damage to a surrounding area with no penalty, like spinning around on a street lamp. There are also ones that deal elemental damage to a surrounding area. Shooting a police car in the first jail makes it explode, causing fire damage, which is mostly fine, and at best it serves as a hint of who to put in your team before rushing in. There are plasma balls here that deal psychic damage. These enemies will be weak to psychic. Somebody wake up Haru, it's killing time! But this isn't always the case. There's one fight in particular that stands out early on for me, where it had these golden swords in the ground, which deal bless damage, but none of the enemies that fight are weak to bless. They were weak to electricity, and I didn't have Ryuji on my team. This fight sticks out to me because it encapsulates most of the problems I have with the gameplay. I had no prior indication this enemy would appear, the button mashing combos do basically nothing, my neutral attacks do bugger all to its guard, I can't swap anyone out during the fight, and now I'm being lied to by the motherfucking interior design! So, I have 2 options. Either I rely entirely on Joker to beat them, during which I will likely use up all my finite SP restoration, or let them kill me so I can swap a team member out for Ryuji. I'm a weak-willed man. In its defense, I understand why there are Bless Enviro attacks, because it's one of the types the Monarch is weak to. You can find similar environmental attacks in the boss area. In hindsight, these were subtle hints to the boss's weaknesses so that you could select your team before the fight, which, upon reflection, works for most of them. There's a jail with a techno-futuristic aesthetic that has zapper guns that do electric damage and crates that deal nuclear damage. And wouldn't you know it, those 2 types are what the boss is weak to. This isn't an ironclad rule, and there are the mini-bosses to account for, but it's not a bad way to hint at it. There's also another aspect that deserves praise for the first few Monarchs. As I said in the first video, the first few Monarchs have some ideological or personal link to a member of the Phantom Thieves, and that member's attribute is one of their weaknesses. For example, the very first jail revolves around an idol that has a connection to Anne, and wouldn't you know it, she's weak to fire attacks. So it's in your best interest to use her in the fight, not only to exploit the weaknesses of the boss, but for the benefit of the narrative. But the flaw lies in these boss fights having you reliant on certain characters. This can be limiting and could cause some characters to be barely touched throughout large portions of the game. Makoto felt like she was mostly on the bench, until that boss in the futuristic jail I mentioned. An ideal boss fight for a game like this would allow you to prevail despite who you had on your team. As long as you had a solid plan of attack, that and your skill should make it work. A good example of this is the Madarame fight in Persona 5. You have about 5 characters at this point, and the boss has different parts of it with resistances to different types. So regardless of your team setup, this boss's puzzle-like challenge remains the same. But it's even better in Royal, when there's a second stage. Clones of Madarame would spawn with different visible strengths and weaknesses. Each team member is strong against one of them, so you can coordinate everyone to hit them all in one turn. It doesn't matter who's in your party, you can figure it out and win. And in future fights, you didn't assemble your team based on element types, but more on their abilities like healing or buffing. I question if Strikers suffers from having so many characters at the beginning. Persona 5 had the benefit of starting with just 4 and slowly built it up, meaning, in the beginning, there was less variety of weaknesses to choose from. It was more likely the enemies would be weak to the elements you and your party currently had, and by the time your roster expanded, you got a whole new range of skills and tactical options, such as, say, swapping out your teammates? In spite of this, the combat in Strikers still fundamentally works, and there's certainly a spectacle to the whole thing. And when you get the hang of everything, and by every SP restorer you can get your mitts on, you'll get through the game rather smoothly. But by getting used to it, and forming the optimal strategies for winning, you realise something. For boss fights, I learned the best way to beat them was to get Joker and at least one other person to swap back and forth hitting their weaknesses, chugging all the SP restorations I had while the other two party members buff and heal. But this made me realise the biggest problem with the gameplay. The way I'm fighting here is almost identical to a turn-based RPG, like the gameplay of the original Persona 5. Isn't that the point? Well, at best, it replicates the gameplay of Persona 5, but at worst, it means the aspects added by Dynasty Warriors don't mean anything. The free-roaming real-time combo mashing of Dynasty Warriors is objectively not your best approach against the significant enemies, and that back-and-forth playstyle I mentioned worked even on the final boss. My point here isn't that the gameplay is bad. Despite the flaws I mentioned, it isn't. My point is that the fusion with Dynasty Warriors ultimately doesn't do anything. You could have played Strikers as a turn-based combat game and very little would be different. All this may not be an issue, as it's certainly more a Persona game than a Dynasty Warriors game. Strikers gameplay is more of an acknowledgement to how many of the Persona elements carried over to Dynasty Warriors, rather than what Dynasty Warriors added to Persona. Whether this is a positive or a negative depends on you, and what you wanted out of the game. The more streamlined elements of Persona have nothing to do with Dynasty Warriors, but are ultimately just there because it's a smaller game. Again, the bond mechanic is a positive example of this, as is the cooking, where you make various dishes yourself, each requiring different ingredients and having different effects. Making a dish for the first time also adds to the bond meter. See? This can work. It's not as if diluting other parts of the original game removes the importance of why it worked in the first place. Right? One of Persona's best mechanics is that you have a set amount of in-game days to complete the main story events. You spend one day going into the palace, getting as far as you can with your current skill level and supplies, then make the decision to head back when you can't go any further and must try again the next day. To a degree, this made it similar to a dungeon crawler, and it was great because there was a continuous sense of consequence. Making a decision to go back had the benefit of recovering your stats and giving you the opportunity to restock your supplies, but it cost a day on your countdown. The obvious risk is of course that you fail if you run out of days, but losing even one day is a lost opportunity to hang out with one of your friends or gain new abilities. In more than one way, you are rewarded for time management and practicality. Strikers doesn't have a timer like this. Days pass as the plot progresses and not because of your in-game actions. Instead of safe rooms, you have checkpoints that serve basically the same function. Save your progress and warp to other checkpoints. You can leave the jail at any checkpoint and at any time to fully restore your health and SP without using any items. The problem is, well, dear viewer, I know that you are a very smart person who will no doubt leave a like and a comment on this video, so I know that you'll pick up on what is wrong with this. After fighting and depleting your SP, you head back to the checkpoint. You leave the jail and follow a loading screen back to the real world, with no time passing. From there, you re-enter it and go through a second loading screen to the jail's entry point. You return to the beginning of the map and you go through a third loading screen to warp to your previous checkpoint. You are now back at full health and SP, at the exact same spot you were, and for all you know, the exact same point in time. Did you spot the problem? Here's an alternative. heal at the checkpoint. Because there's no consequence of time, there's no necessity to return to the real world like there once was. It causes you to go through 3 loading screens to get back where you were with no repercussions. And the game does nothing to stop you doing this, so why not just cut the fat? It feels like they tried too hard to carry the whole concept over, then removed the key component that made it work, and didn't realize how that affected the rest of it. It's like making a cake without any sugar. You can still call it a cake, but let's be honest, the sugar is what made it good. Without it, it just tastes like circular bread. The checkpoints in Strikers are circular bread. I don't see why they couldn't have just merged the healing and the checkpoints to save us time. I mean, you can access the Velvet Room from the checkpoint, while it used to be a separate thing from the safe rooms. Which brings us to the Velvet Room. The Velvet Room is essentially the Pokemon Center of Persona. It's a recurring area across the franchise, which is hosted by Igor, and an assistant that changes in each game, 5's assistant being Lavenza. This is where you can use several services to create and improve your personas, fusing 2 together to become a stronger one with a guillotine, sacrificing one to make another more powerful by hanging them, or turning them into items with an electric chair. Yeah, it's pretty morbid. Don't think about it. And you can bet your bottom dollar it's back in Strikers, and is understandably less expansive. And without the guillotines, electric chairs, and hanging gallows, we must go for a more humane approach to fusing personas. Iron Maidens. Naturally, the amount of personas you can acquire has been limited as you're starting from the ground again. The fundamental process is the same: find personas in-game, come to the Velvet Room, and execute— fuse them for stronger ones. Though, unlike the previous game, personas can't be fused without them being a certain level. On top of that, you can only fuse by result. You can no longer just pick any 2 in your team and see the options. These points, combined with the lesser quantity of personas, does limit what you can do. In many cases, you'll enter the Velvet Room with a bunch of new personas, only to realize you can't actually fuse them. Basically, you're going in blind. The result of this is more time spent grinding to not only get specific personas, but to bump them up to a specific level. Some of which demand you get one of the earliest personas in the game and boost them by 40 levels. Imagine if you had to boost a Magikarp by 40 levels to evolve it. You could be generous and say this need to grind justifies taking out the day timer. But, okay, come with me on this. You are on the executive board in the Atlas TECMO Sega building. Then someone, with a genuine smile and a spark in their eye, stands up and says, "I have an idea. Let's remove the franchise's best mechanic so players have to grind." What would your first thought be? Mine would be this. It's not entirely bad though. Persona 5 could be criticized for having such a bloated list of personas that individually leveling them all up would be unreasonable. So shortening the list of personas with more focus on leveling them up is less deserving of an electric chair. So that's a positive. But there is a small example of another mechanic that was circular bread. There was a new feature in Royal where the Velvet Room would randomly raise an alarm. What is this alarm? Why is it there? I don't know. And the game sure as hell doesn't tell you, but it's good. The alarm is a sort of in-game event, and personas fused during this time are given buffs and opportunities for new, and likely better, powers. However, if you use any one of the Velvet Room's services more than once during an alarm, the effect of said service is randomized. For example, let's say you want to fuse personas A and B to get C. The first fusion will give you C+, a buffed out version of what you were expecting. But if you go for it a second time, there's a good chance you'll fuse A and B and get H. This, of all things, has been brought to Strikers, but there's no clear alarm or warning. As you're about to perform a fusion, any old fusion, the Iron Maidens will just randomly explode and give you a different result. Which, given all the time you've spent leveling, as well as the money you've no doubt spent, this is a textbook case of a dick move. Though Lavenza's blank expression as she gets hit by a loose bolt is always quite funny. So far, most of my points about the gameplay are criticisms. And to be entirely honest, it's a challenge to think of anything the gameplay does spectacularly, or at the very least, better than the original. The main selling points focus on the pace and the spectacle of it all. And it is certainly that. Both Persona 5 and Dynasty Warriors, for all their differences, have styles that complement one another. The takedown of 50 people in Dynasty Warriors with a single slash is nothing but enhanced when it's a chained golem in an overcoat. And instead of a slash, it's millions of bullets from dual revolvers. Oh, look at him twirl it. So cool. I want his babies. My main reason for highlighting the flaws is ultimately that I don't believe the combat is the selling point. Or at the very least, it's not the sole reason the game is worth playing. Because the gameplay wasn't the main selling point of Persona 5 either. Not everything translated perfectly to a Dynasty Warriors spin-off. But the things that mattered did. The style, the music, the sheer spectacle, the earnestly unsubtle social commentary, the mediocre anime cutscenes, and most importantly, the heart. It's still undeniably there, and the main selling point of Strikers is, well, it's still Persona 5. The best compliment I can give it is that it reminded me why I loved it so much. Strikers wasn't necessary, it didn't need to exist, but how it was able to tell a compelling story in spite of that, even when it rehashes and references beloved moments, is a testament to the strength of the game's core. I don't know if I can say it improved the original in any way, but we can take solace in that it doesn't damage Persona 5. It does, however, damage Persona 5 Royal. Well, I said we were going to get to Royal, so here we go. I'd like to start by addressing the obvious, which is that Strikers doesn't acknowledge the existence of Persona 5's expansion, Persona 5 Royal. It doesn't mention its events or its new characters. Those characters being the new Phantom Thief Kasumi and the school counselor turned antagonist, Dr. Maruki. So, are you ready for my epic rant about how it was a crime these two were overlooked in Strikers? Well, here you go! It's fine. I'm not too bothered.
Wait, come on, hear me out. Ow!
While both these characters are great, I'm honestly okay they weren't a part of Strikers. Maruki had his entire arc resolved at the end of Royal, so there really isn't a reason to bring him back, and Kasumi's involvement in the main plot was rather minimal, so it's hard to consider her as integral to the Phantom Thieves as the rest of them. She's great for the parts that involved her, but adding her to Strikers would only just bloat the roster even more. Maybe they'll add her as DLC. It would certainly be fitting. But the point is, the absence of the characters is not the Royal conundrum. The Royal conundrum is something else. My thoughts on Strikers and Royal are actually rather similar. Neither were necessary, but were fun and welcome regardless. Persona 5 was a complete game without Royal, and even with the additions, it didn't fundamentally alter that much. Most of the core changes were gameplay, whereas the new plot elements were ultimately fitted into blank spaces. What Royal did was make room between parts of the original, and insert scenes and moments for the new characters to set up the additional palace at the end of the game. Even the new palace itself did this. Once it ends, the next scene is everybody trying to get Joker out of jail, which is what they would have done anyway if Royal never happened. It certainly fleshes out certain aspects, like Akechi, but fundamentally it didn't alter any outcome of the game's main story, except the ending, where they differ in one crucial aspect. The original ended with Joker heading back to his hometown after his probation ends, but on his way to the train station, he sees the Phantom Thieves waiting for him, saying they're going to drive him back to his hometown instead. And this is nice. It's one last hurrah of the group as they drive off into the sunset, or early morning, I don't know what time it is. Royal's ending adds a scene before Joker's last day, where the group has one final meeting in LeBlanc, where one by one they announce that they're going their separate ways to follow their own goals. Ryuji wants to move closer to a physiotherapy center to fix his leg. Anne wants to move away to pursue her modeling career. Futaba re-enrolls in education, etc, etc. Each member of the Phantom Thieves is going their separate ways, making it less likely the entire group would meet up again, if at all. It was more somber, but there was something very bittersweet about this ending. You even have scenes in the credits of each member taking the next step into their lives, highlighting the fact that the journey was great, but it's time to move on. So where does Strikers come into this? Well, the mere fact they were able to meet up this easily at the beginning of Strikers devalues the point and even the themes that Royal added to the game. Alright, look, it isn't 100% impossible for them to meet up again in Royal's universe, but it definitely would have been much harder for each of them. And regardless of whether it's possible, it makes that sense of bittersweet closure feel like a waste. So my question is, if Strikers was planned around the same time as the original, why alter the ending of Royal at all? What was the point of giving a more conclusive ending to a story that was planned to continue? Why fragment the canon? This was probably the biggest concern with Strikers. Regardless of its individual quality as a game, it raises an uncomfortable question. When should this end? At some point, we need to ask ourselves, when should the journey of the Phantom Thieves actually end? Because fragmenting and artificially extending it only results in diluting the story and the characters. And for the record, I don't think either Royal or Strikers do that. I like both of them, and they undeniably carry on the strengths of the main game. But who's to say there won't be another sequel? Or a continuation of Royal? Who's to say the endings and lessons won't be made more redundant in those? You can only really state a story is good once it's ended. Otherwise, you risk it slowly declining and losing what made it special. And that is how you'll remember it, as opposed to how good it used to be. I don't want the Phantom Thieves to be like Dynasty Warriors, where they're less characters and more commodities to be reinserted and played out repeatedly. I want them to be flawed, relatable characters, getting a stronger understanding of who they are. I'm thankful that Strikers was as faithful as it was, and it definitely succeeded in building its own ideas, but I think it would be best if we just called it there. Let's conclude the journey of the Phantom Thieves and remember them for what they brought, and, like each of them, move on to become something better. So, whether you personally prefer Royal or Strikers, whether you think one is canon and the other isn't, whether you prefer one red-headed bless user or the other, we can all agree it was a journey that stole our hearts.